When food was scarce and every ingredient mattered, farmhouse families mastered the art of survival cooking, turning simple pantry staples into meals that nourished generations. These 25 forgotten recipes kept them going. Let's bring them back. So today, we're going to start off with pickled watermelon rind. This became a popular recipe throughout much of the southern parts of America and their farm kitchens because it was a way for people to cut down on what they were wasting and also preserve some food at the same time. Watermelons were already something people were growing abundantly throughout the South, and since a lot of farm families were often planting and harvesting really large quantities, they thought they couldn't let any of that hard-earned harvest go to waste, so they would use up every last watermelon they could no matter how. Still, a watermelon is a daunting fruit to binge-eat your way through, and pickling the rinds is the solution. It turns the fruit into something that was about to be thrown away into this sweet, delicious dessert that can even be enjoyed after watermelon season is totally over. During the Depression, it helped people stay hydrated as best as they could. Egg gravy was more or less a similar story. It had been common throughout many farmhouse kitchens for being one of the most reliable breakfast recipes, especially in the Appalachian regions and the South. Fresh eggs were even more abundant than meat used to be thanks to everyone having chickens. Unlike a lot of other gravies, which were savory and based on meat, the egg gravy was a really simple and cost-effective way for people to get a rich sauce that didn't need any of your protein. It was something that people would pour over cornbread most of the time, or have with like fried potatoes or something. The dish was really popular whenever you wanted to stretch your pantry out, not waste too much meat, and just get by on something that's at least decent if not very filling. It was really common during times where supplies were low or during droughts and famines. Egg gravy was part of a larger breakfast table too, where it would often be served as a mild and buttery side. In terms of taste, besides just being buttery, you can also expect this to really have a nice custard-like texture, depending on how thoroughly the eggs get beaten. Chow-chow relish, on the other hand, was a kind of pickled vegetable relish that had originated from a different blend of inspirations and influences. Among those, you could count Southern traditions, Appalachian flavors, and Pennsylvania Dutch preferences. In the last region, a sweeter and more tart-like flavor was preferred. It was a way for people to help keep their end-of-season crops nice, safe, and preserved, especially before the first days of winter would start to hit. In the South, most people preferred their chow-chow as a topping for cornbread and beans instead of anything else. But if you kept on heading towards Texas, you would encounter a lot of chow-chow relishes that were much more on the spicier side. This was a meal often being served with things like pinto beans, black-eyed peas, and other bright and tangy dishes, so that it could contrast nicely with them. Chow-chow was typically always made using finely chopped vegetables like bell peppers, onions, corn, shredded green tomatoes, and different kinds of beans. It would be stored in a vinegar brine with sugar, turmeric, celery seed, and some mustard seed, and this would be canned and used throughout the winter. Pretty convenient, right? Salt pork beans were something that we actually got over from New England and was a big part of Midwestern farm cooking. It's something you could say is really tied to both colonial influence on American eating practices and habits and also farmhouse culture, which was largely shaped by how economical a recipe could be. Salt pork would be cured instead of being smoked, and it was one of the most common forms of meat you would ever find in regions with lots of farm homes. It was a time before refrigeration had become such a nationally accessible and available phenomena, so people had to make do with other means of storage and preservation. This dish was started with dried beans, which had to be soaked overnight, and a piece of salt pork would be added to the pot. Then, molasses or brown sugar would be thrown in, and you had stark differences between the New England way of doing this, where a lot of Europeans were actually living, and the Southern style of doing this. See, in New England, people would oversweeten it with molasses and slow bake it in these earthenware pots, and that's a lot more similar to a version of this dish known as Boston baked beans. In the South, it was actually made over stovetops with more peppers and less sweets, and in the Midwest, molasses may not even have been a part of the picture because most people were actually using maple syrup. Cabbage and noodles, or otherwise known as haluski in Eastern European culture, is a really simple lost farmhouse recipe that's also really filling. It was a dish that was first brought over to America by a lot of immigrants who had begun to come in from Poland and Slovakia. It beamed such a common recipe in farmhouse kitchens and regions with a lot of farmsteads because of the influence of Pennsylvania, where a lot of Eastern European immigrants had found community. There were other states like Ohio and other parts of the Midwest, but it was basically these places that first started being centers for European culture to mix and mesh in with American culinary habits. The dish was something you would make by frying and shredding cabbage in butter and then tossing it with egg noodles, with some onions for a bit of a flavor kick. Sometimes, people would throw in meat, but in farms that weren't doing so well, this was always a meatless dish. It was also another winter dish, especially because people had a habit of growing cabbage to get through the winter, as rough as it sounds. Farmhouse Scrapple is as traditional as it gets. I mean, it has a farmhouse in the name. Pennsylvania Dutch regions were essentially the place of origin for this, because when the German and Dutch immigrants did settle in our dear old Pennsylvania, they started to make this dish a defining classic of the times, and personally, I think they did a pretty good job of that. It was an example of the waste not, want not mentality of cooking, and that showed if you just look at the preparation process for a small second. See, this was something that was made entirely of pork scraps that had been left over while the animal was being butchered, and it would be combined with cornmeal, which was one of the easiest and abundant crops you could grow. This boiled broth mixture of pork scraps, which could have been anything, from strips of liver to head meat, mixed in with cornmeal, black pepper, thyme, and sage, was actually really aromatic. Then, people would pour this gently into loaf pans and have it chilled, then slice it and pan-fry it until it was crispy. It was really unique for a lot of Americans, but it was also ridiculously fun because of how different the preparation process was in the dish. Apple pandowdy is something that hails from colonial-era times, and farmhouse culture was still the dominant one then too. But it was definitely different from, let's say, around the time of watermelon rinds. It was a really practical way to use up fall apple harvests, which were basically just a part of the entire culture of not wasting even a grain of wheat. I gotta hand it to them, that kind of avoidance for wastage is a learned skill, and it's a pretty impressive one. This was a dish that basically wanted to do away with the elaborate process that pies required you to go through. But you might be wondering what the term Pandowdy even means. Well, it just refers to the method of dowdying. This means when you break up the crust of the pie in the middle of the baking process, and why would you do this? Well, it would make way for those juices to really sink in and get absorbed so that you get a pie with the deepest and boldest flavor possible. Apples would be pretty much in stock throughout the fall season, so it's not like anyone was ever hurting for them. This was a really sweet dish and one of the nicest things to make for your family during holidays and throughout the comforting, familiar, and nostalgic atmosphere of fall. Buttermilk soup was a really simple and nourishing dish that many households relied on, especially Scandinavian, German, and Pennsylvanian Dutch communities. Buttermilk was something that arguably the entirety of America, suburban, urban, or rural, was dependent on, but this soup was something you would only find in farmhouses. Buttermilk essentially is just a byproduct of people making butter at home, which you'd actually be a little surprised at how common that was. This soup was a really easy way to get rid of that, though, since it required so much of it. Buttermilk was something you had to be really gentle with when you were preparing it. The heat had to be just the right pressure. It had to be thickened with flour, but too much of it would ruin it. It needed a pinch of cornstarch, not a dash, nor a dollop, and not a generous heap. It needed a very specific pinch. So it was all these tiny details you had to get an intuitive feel for before you could start making these off the top of your head every day. But once you did, it was worth it. Beef drippings gravy was essentially one of the nicest things you could find in farms and pioneer households. In those homes, large cuts of beef like steaks and roasts would most often be made in cast iron pans or ovens. These would leave behind an intense layer of really flavorful brown and crispy bits. You know the ones I'm talking about, right? It's like whenever you're at a barbecue and you try to get the part of the meat that's perfectly charred and browned. After cooking roast beef, steaks, and ground beef that had been prepared in different ways, the pan drippings would be collected, and then a roux would be made by whisking flour into that dripping. Then, the paste was further refined with water, milk, or some beef broth, and you eventually got this really nice and thick gravy. In culture, people used to have this dish for Sunday dinners very often, and church potlucks would also have it since it was such a low-effort dish. Corn cob jelly is a farmhouse jelly that has earned its certifiable classic status. It was a technique that had been developed by women who were alive throughout the Depression, working as home chefs for entire communities at a time, aided by pioneer women. It was a way to avoid wasting absolutely any part of the corn, something people had become used to doing despite the way they would genuinely try to avoid waste with everything. The issue with this one was that they just didn't know what to do with the cob until this recipe came along. See, after the corn had become stripped from the cob, these were collected and kept safe because later, these women would boil them in water. Seems like it wouldn't do a lot, right? That's only if you don't know that the cobs of corn are actually filled with natural starches and sugars. This strained liquid would then be mixed with a heap of sugar, lemon juice, and the magic ingredient, pectin, which would basically help create a golden red jelly. This was one of the best recipes throughout the Great Depression because it was free, made using a natural resource, and it was sweet and low effort, which seemed like divine intervention back in those times. Gooseberry Fool was something that was considered a colonial-era dessert with a lot of roots in English and German cooking. It was something that was first brought over to America by the very first wave of settlers. See, a thing about gooseberries is that they seem to love the cold, so they really did well in the Appalachian foothills and the generally cooler New England climate. They were one of the first available fruits because they would pop up ready to eat towards late spring and early summer. And in times where sugar was a luxury, especially the colonial area, tart fruits like these gooseberries were honestly a lifesaver. Fresh gooseberries were the most commonly eaten ones, but stewing them with sugar made a jam-like consistency that was really wonderful. Folding it into whipped cream or a custard-esque mixture with some brandy would net you a gooseberry fool, and it was an elegant dessert that was really popular because of how little it used and how much it got in return. Oatmeal meatloaf was essentially one of the most popular farm kitchen recipes during the early 20th century, particularly in the Appalachian region where oats were not only widely available but deeply beloved. Now I know you're going to stop and think how you can ever concoct a meatloaf out of oatmeal and why you would even feel the unholy impulse to do so. Basically, this dish was something that people made when they really had nothing else to eat, and trust me, they weren't making it with excitement. You'll get the impulse, but you're right, it was a hard bite to swallow. The combination of ground beef and pork with rolled oats instead of traditional breadcrumbs was just a sensory and textural no-no for a lot of people, and while the milk and broth helped to soften the days whilst keeping the meatloaf moisturized, it would really not help that much. The Worcestershire sauce added flavor for some, but for a lot of people this was just a mess that wasn't really redeemable, its only one benefit being that it was stupidly good at keeping you full. It was the kind of thing you would see in community suppers and church potlucks during the early 20th century as a way to stretch a little bit of meat into something that can actually go around a big group of people. The last thing you would want for your breakfast is for it to be bitter, but sour milk pancakes actually happened to be exactly that. They were this really practical, everyday dish that quickly began to take over a lot of farmhouse kitchens, especially before refrigeration had become a widespread, dependable, and reliable source of preservation for a lot of people. Rather than wasting fresh milk, cooks instead preferred to utilize it however they could manage to in the form of pancakes. And that was a pretty damned good usage, if I do say so myself, considering the economic difficulty these times were plagued by. See, the acidity of the sour milk would help make these extra light and fluffy pancakes that, once combined with baking soda, would end up making a really lovely pancake that was not only just like the original thing in terms of how it would feel, but with an entirely new kick to it. It's like when you unlock your character's super secret mid-game form in an action game. Green tomato pie was a really big classic throughout the southern and midwestern regions, and it's easily up there in the Hall of Fame as far as desserts are considered. Still, a tomato pie is something to raise your eyebrow at, and not necessarily out of interest. A green tomato pie even more so. So the question is, Do we have another oatmeal meatloaf situation on our hands, or do we have something worth bringing to the table, pun intended? Well, the answer, like always, is that it depends. See, these thinly sliced green tomatoes were made with a lot of warm spices, and you might not be into that, so it depends. It was also made with lard and a butter crust, and then topped with a double crust, with some versions even having ginger and raisins for more spice and sweetness, and you may not be into that. Now, the dish was really good at preventing waste because this way tomatoes wouldn't just sit there catching dust and rot, and it also had a lot of decent health benefits, and you might be into both of those things. It was a wonderful winter dish, and for people that actually do enjoy tomatoes, this dish made the best use of them, and you again might be into that. So the answer, my dear viewer, like with much in life, is that it depends. On you. Entirely. But hey, at least you know you can make a pie even out of green tomatoes now. Rabbit stew is a dish that I'm sure you've not only just heard of, but probably even had a few times. It was such a common stew to make in the frontier and in farm kitchens, especially throughout the South, but particularly in the Midwest. This was because most of America's rabbits ended up being there, and besides being perfect stew material, those rabbits were also an excellent source of protein for hunters, trappers, and local poachers, villagers, who were making their day-to-day bread living off of the land. During the Great Depression, thanks to a lot of wartime rationing, rabbit started to become a cheap protein that was a nice alternative to chicken or beef, and this meant that people started experimenting. Now, a lot of recipes were cooked with chicken and beef being substituted for rabbit, but nothing quite stuck to the wall as well as rabbit did. Dressed rabbit was joined and browned in bacon drippings or lard before it could be thrown into the stew, and vegetables like onions, carrots, potatoes, and celery were added so that you'd get a more filling meal. The stew was then simmered with different kinds of robots, herbs, and sometimes wine if you really wanted to feel like you were eating rich. Cottage cheese pie is this really European-style farmhouse dessert that got particularly famous and well-received in Pennsylvania Dutch communities where there were large concentrations of German populations. It was also something that, despite having no cultural attachments to the dish, got really popular in Scandinavian communities. Thanks to the flavor, I guess. It seems like it doesn't matter whether something's new or old. If it really hits the spot, it transcends all kinds of social barriers, and I think there's some comfort in food like that. Anyway, before refrigeration became such a thing, farmers basically made fresh cottage cheese from any surplus milk they had, and obviously the next thing you'd want to do is begin the process of pie baking. This was a way for people to make a really nice custard-like dessert that was kind of similar to cheesecake. The dish had a lot of cultural significance for the Pennsylvania Dutch, at least because of how it reminded them of the flavors they had back home. It was also made using traditional European cheese-making techniques, which were being taught to people like American citizens who had never left the country. It was such a practical way to make use of excess amounts of dairy that gatekeeping it really didn't make sense or benefit anyone. Corn fritters are a deeply serious matter for a lot of different communities in America, thanks to how they have roots in Native American, Southern, and Midwestern cooking. Now, those are just three different terms, but when you think about how much land and how many different kinds of people that really covers, it's astounding that they ever got this popular. They were something that became a farmhouse favorite mostly because of how easy it was to grow corn. So think of it like that one cigarette that only gets sales because it's cheap. Anyway, fresh or creamed corn kernels had to be mixed in with flour, eggs, milk, and baking powder. And the thing about corn was that since it was cheap, it meant you could spend more of your budget on the dessert ingredients. Stuff like butter, cream, and milk didn't come cheap most of the time, and not having to spend more money on a main ingredient helped make these things more accessible. These fritters were one of the sweetest and nicest desserts you could have, and they were really similar to Johnny cakes, often being served with stuff like fried chicken or different kinds of pork chops. Homemade head cheese is this really traditional farmhouse cold cut that's actually got a bit of a disgusting or at least uncomfortable story behind it. See, typically, this is made from the pig's head, except the head is boiled and the head meat is set in this really gelatin-rich broth, so yeah, unless you're a massive stickler for all things pig-flavored, this genuinely may be too intense for you. It wasn't for a lot of German and French people though, but hey, different strokes for different folks. Not everyone could appreciate the extra gamey flavor of the homemade head cheese, and funnily enough, despite having cheese in the name, the dish actually had no cheese at all whatsoever. I'm not really sure why they ever even called it that to begin with, honestly, but what can you do? What I'm not sure about either is why butchering an entire hog was a family tradition in Pennsylvania Dutch and Midwestern kitchens. I mean, who thinks about father-son bonding time and decides to go out and split a hog's skull in two? Turnip hash was just really lovely all around because it was this super humble and hearty dish that got extremely popular in New England, Midwestern areas, and farmsteads and Appalachian communities. A lot of farming culture was relevant to these areas, so a lot of the lost recipes we have are also from them. In them, root vegetables were also really commonly consumed. They used to make up most of people's diets and eating habits throughout the winters as well. Funnily enough, when people think of top American crops and vegetables, it's always corn at number 1 and potatoes at number 2, but long before potatoes established their dominance over the American masses, turnips actually used to be a staple crop. One of the biggest reasons for that's the way they would last you throughout the cold months and how farm families could basically make several different kinds of things with them. You could make mashes, hashes, soups, and even put them in stews, or serve them up on the side with whatever meat scraps you had. Turnip hash was a really simple winter dish, but it got the job done well enough because it was one of the most refreshing and warming breakfasts you could have. Even Mayo, so if you had the chance to eat this with roast pork or corned beef. Brown bread in a can. Yep, that's the entire premise of this one. And I know you might already be interested in hitting that fast forward button over there a few times, but hear me out for a second. This is a classic dish and I'm going to give you 3 seconds maximum to guess it because it's really obvious. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if it wasn't clear enough, it's popular in New England because, of course, where else do you hear about things like that? It was something that colonists had brought on over during the very start of the colonial era, and it was during when wheat flour was generally considered a scarce resource in most places. Rye and cornmeal were the more popular substitute for people, especially when it came to cheating on nice steamed breads. These breads were in hot demand in places like Boston, Vermont, and Maine, and farmhouses there would sell them whenever they could for a quick buck. So, one of the ways of making this easily marketable, hotly demanded steamed bread was by making brown bread in a can, and the cans would be placed in pots of simmering water and steamed for 2 to 3 hours properly and thoroughly, right? They really had to get in there and make sure his baby was being put through a sauna properly. This was a signature New England dish that would most often be served with baked beans and some salt pork, which, believe it or not, was actually a very typical Boston Saturday night dinner. Now, the thing about sorrel soup is that while it has roots in European peasant cooking, it was actually fought on over by so many different kinds of Americans that it's most likely lost its original touch now. Eastern European immigrants, Germans, and Dutch people that came and settled in Pennsylvania were known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, and they most often made homes in the areas I've been mentioning throughout the video so far. Then there was sorrel, which was this really lemony-tasting green that was one of the earliest vegetables you could plant and harvest. It would come right at the start of spring, meaning that it was one of the vegetables people would plant immediately and always be looking out for. You would look forward to eating something like that after a long, cold, and grueling winter, wouldn't you? Fresh sorrel leaves were precious to people. They would be taken from gardens or foraged, and they were wilted in butter, simmered in broth, mixed with vegetables, and served hot or chilled with some sour cream. Not only was it a wonderfully refreshing and nutritious dish to add, it was also really heartwarming to have something like that. It means something to restore strength to a person's body, but helping them feel better is a whole other animal entirely. Hog Maw is this dish that was really popular with all sorts of Southern families. It was traditionally always prepared after hog butchering was done, and farm families, as you know, were very invested in getting all possible returns on investment. The stomach, or the maw of the hog, was thoroughly cleaned before it could be ready for the stuffing. Once the cleaning was done, which, mind you, was really a hard thing to do because you also had to blanch it properly, it would be stuffed with a mix of potatoes, onions, seasonings, and bits of sausage. Some different versions of it also used a bread stuffing or a cabbage depending on the place, but most areas stuck to the traditional recipes. This stuffed stomach would then be boiled or baked until it was tender, and if you were baking it, you would get some extra crispy bits of skin on the outside. They would then be sliced and served with different kinds of gravy or mustard and served with sauerkraut. This is a quintessential Pennsylvania Dutch and Southern America dish, and it's always something you would see at farm dinners or big holiday gatherings. Hog Maw had a really smoky flavor despite what you're thinking. It wasn't overly gamey, and the sausage and seasonings really helped mask a lot of the metallic taste. Blackberry dumplings were essentially one of the most resourceful farmhouse desserts. This was one of those things where you didn't even need to really work for it, you know? Blackberries were the kind of thing you could source easily. If it wasn't already being grown in your garden, then it was out there in the wild, and you could just forage it. Next, all you had to do was mix in some water and sugar, simmer, and craft the perfect syrupy base for your dessert. So, steaming a dessert isn't actually too common in most American recipes nowadays, but this was one of those recipes where you had to steam the dumplings until they were fluffy and just the right amount of soft. Some recipes also had a lot of cinnamon, nutmeg, lemon zest, things like that, thrown in all for extra flavor and to just give it a more well-rounded depth overall. Next, you would serve it with a whipped cream topping or just some vanilla ice cream on the side, and it was honestly a delight to eat. It showed people that you actually didn't need money or fancy ingredients to have a dessert that would do everything you needed it to. Plus, it was a summer dessert, so it really helped with the heat after a long day of working the farm. It didn't even need baking, just a stovetop and some cast iron skillets. So bean pie is just this really African-American dish that was actually made as a nutritious alternative to something that people had more or less become addicted to, which was sweet potato pie. This was a dish that had been made with pureed navy beans, instead of the usual assortment of vegetables with way too much starch content. It became a dish that widely associated with black bakeries and street vendors, and its origins were something that actually could be traced back to the widespread usage of beans in early Southern and farmhouse kitchens. This was a dish that made extensive use of navy beans, after all. You first mashed them, then blended them with evaporated milk, your usual pie ingredients, and vanilla extract, and then you would pour that into a pie crust and bake it until it was set. It was also very common in African-American Muslim communities, and with Ramadan coming up, maybe this is a blast from the past you want to try out this March? Stuffed cabbage rolls were essentially comfort food for American farmhouse kitchens, especially those in the Midwestern regions. Their origins are something you can pinpoint to Jewish and Eastern European immigrants who first started bringing in recipes for cabbage rolls that had been a part of their traditions. Mind you, this is all stuff that's way back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and over time, they've become big staples in the American cooking sphere. It's just that they're so good for cold weather, you know? If this video has taught you anything, let it be this. In the winters, cabbage is definitely your best friend. Stuffed cabbage rolls were something that were deeply relied upon by European peasants and impoverished families, so in tough times, farmhouses found that this recipe was actually working wonders. These rolls became popular in cities too, not just farmhouses. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago were all places where the European cabbage craze continued captivating consistently. It's like suddenly everyone was a cabbage roll fan. Each community had its own way of making the dish too, like with Polish people you had a bit more creamy elements, with German people you had a bit more spice. The basic concept was the same though, and that's why I guess it was something people could enjoy no matter where they were. A name you might not hear very often in the cooking world, as far as French cuisine is concerned at least, is Marie-Antoine Carême, but you can thank her for some amazing dishes such as the vol au vent. This is actually something that got so popularized in American cookbooks in the mid-20th century. In the 1970s, when a national interest in foreign cooking really started popping off in America, there were a lot of trends centered around haute cuisine, and especially things you would find in premium French restaurants. In French-American communities, a vol au vent was a typical Saturday lunch that you would find being served up by your grandmother. Marie-Antoine Carême is a legendary French chef, and a reason she got that acclaim was because she managed to make up dishes that would suit the average household. vol au vent is actually not really something you'd find at a five-star restaurant or on the upper end of what your wallet could afford. Most people would treat this like a party meal, something to serve at cocktail parties or New Year's ones. It was just puff pastry filled in with chicken, mushrooms, and creamy sauces, but it blended all of those together to make a really warm and earthy taste, which makes it perfectly suited to something you'd associate with your grandma's table. Let's kick things off with a classic Depression-era stew. Now, this wasn't your fancy beef stew. It was more like a throw-everything-in-the-pot kind of deal. We're talking potatoes, carrots, onions, and maybe some barley if you were lucky. And the meat? Well, if you had any, great. If not, no worries. It's also known as mulligan stew or hobo stew and was originally created by American hobos in camps in the early 1900s. During the Great Depression, homeless men would sleep in a hobo jungle. Traditionally, the jungle would have a large campfire and a pot into which each person would put a portion of their food to create a shared dish that was, hopefully, more tasteful and varied than his original portion. It made you feel like you were getting a real meal, even if it was mostly broth. Yeah, the next time you need to clean out your fridge, channel your inner 1930s chef and whip up some Depression-era stew. You might just find a new favorite comfort food. Let's take a look at them. So braised beef tongue might be something you are not used to hearing, and the idea of beef tongue in general might be icky to some. Still, keep your minds open because the people back then definitely had to, and what they found out was that it is not so bad. Maybe you might be in for a culinary shakeup too? Either way, braised beef tongue was quite a popular dish that would typically be served in a casserole-like manner during World War II. Due to the war, it was very difficult for families to acquire the meats they were typically used to having, and beef tongue was rubbery and tough, but it was the best they could get. Braising it made for a softer bite and a lot of flavor, so you had all your protein and nutrition needs ticked off cheap and easy. That was a lot more than you could expect during wartime. Boiled cactus pads, or as they're also called, nopales. In the days when the pantry was bare and the garden was dust, people turned to the desert for dinner. To think that someone looked at a prickly cactus and thought, yep, let's eat that. Necessity is the mother of invention, and nopales proved to be surprisingly edible and nutritious. The pads were stripped of their needles, carefully and boiled until tender, and had a tangy, almost lemony taste. They would chop them up, season them with whatever spices they had left, and serve them as a side dish. They were even thrown into stews, where their slimy texture acted as a natural thickener. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but when it came to survival, boiled cactus was a blessing in disguise. Fast forward to today, and nopales are a delicacy in Mexican cuisine. During the Dust Bowl, they weren't about taste, they were about survival. Those desperate cooks never imagined what they saw as hardship food would one day be served in trendy restaurants. Cactus pads proved that even in hard times, resourcefulness can take ouch and turn it into yum. Spiedis are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Spiedis set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Spiedifests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Next up is the infamous garbage plate. Before you start raising eyebrows because of the name of this one, just hear me out. So this was basically a mishmash of whatever was on hand. Imagine a plate filled to the brim with macaroni salad, home fries, baked beans, and some kind of protein like sausage or ground beef. And don't forget the toppings: chili, onions, mustard, and your choice of hot sauce or ketchup. Sounds appetizing, right? The garbage plate originated in 1918, the garbage plate, and became the signature dish of Rochester. If you missed out on it, don't fret, because it's still served by numerous restaurants under names such as Rochester Plate, Trash Plate, or Simply Plate. This meal was a classic when wallets were tight back in the day and there weren't many gourmet options on hand. Plus, it had all the carbs and fats you needed to keep going through tough times, and the kids loved it. What's not to love about fries and macaroni? This dish is a classic example of don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, by its name. Roosevelt Coffee was a beverage that people both created and drank much more out of necessity than commonly shared caffeine preferences or a newly acquired taste. People needed to make their coffee rations last as long as possible, and one trick they found out that greatly extended the duration of a batch was to reuse grounds. With the US already rationing coffee to a pound per household every 5 weeks, things were rough. The end product was a thin and watery drink that tasted close enough to a fresh cup while taking the real worries of spending more than they were able to on coffee off of people's shoulders. Honestly, it was not that bad either, and it was named Roosevelt Coffee in honor of the president if you wanted some historical trivia to spice the drink up further. If you ever find yourself not being able to get some fresh grounds, maybe try making a batch of this and see how you find it. You may be just as surprised as Americans back then with each sip. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right, those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball. Cold milk soup? But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. Eggless sponge cakes might be a concept that you cannot imagine or wrap your head around today, but back then, a lot of people skipped the eggs entirely. What people used instead were margarine, sugar, and syrups to get the same vibe. What you got was a crowd entirely in favor of a sponge cake that was airy, fluffy, and made the best of your resources. Wartime brings out the frugality in everyone, but in this case, it brought out the inner baker with a quick fix or workaround for everything. If you did not have ingredients or could not spare them, then you did not have to worry. You could still enjoy a yummy dessert with your family, and this is a testament to human creativity and how even the bleakest of situations can never kill your sweet tooth. Forget the meat aisle. What do you do when there's no meat? You make mock sausage. As you might have guessed, there was not exactly an abundance of food during the Dust Bowl era, so people started to experiment. The mock sausage was a mashup of anything remotely sausage adjacent: meals, flour, grains, breads, spices, and perhaps a little oil if you were fortunate. To make it, you would combine these simple ingredients into a paste, form it into patties similar to sausage, and then fry. The result? A breakfast sausage knockoff of sorts. But come on, nobody was ever deceived here. Nevertheless, the spices did their job, and in the worst of circumstances, one must do the worst of things. They ate mock sausage with whatever was available: bread, beans, or boiled greens, and it was a regular part of survival food. The mock sausage was not only about feeding people, but also about maintaining everyday life's appearance. It provided families an opportunity to consume something that at least resembled something they used to know. What is even more astonishing is how these recipes sustained spirits, and how it is possible for flavor not to disappear even when the ingredients have. Today, mock sausage is quite popular in the vegan and vegetarian community. But back then, it was about making a meal out of every single grain you had and ensuring that it was filling. This is what you can say about making the impossible possible. You hear the name Rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Prune pudding. Sounds delicious, right? Nothing unusual about this one. It was a classic hit. Prunes were a popular choice during the Depression because they were cheap, stored well, and were, well, let's just say, effective. Many prominent figures during the 1930s ate frugally, just as most Americans did during the Great Depression. To promote the support of frugal and thrifty eating, Eleanor Roosevelt served prune pudding at formal White House functions. And that's how prunes became all the rage. The fruit was cooked until soft, mashed up, mixed with water and sugar, and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken it up. This dessert might not win any beauty contests, but it was a sweet treat that many families enjoyed. Prunes are not the most, luxurious of items out there. I'm sure you pass by prunes in the grocery store without even glancing at them, but they were a lifesaver for our taste buds back in the day. You know what that calls for? A place for them in your cart next time you go grocery shopping. By now, you must be getting an idea of how many basic things really slipped out of people's hands. including once common delicacies like sour cream. People found a good replacement that met them halfway for more or less the same experience in potato flour sour cream, which used potato flour and sugar to copy the essential taste of sour cream. It came pretty close too, if we do say so ourselves. You do not have to hear it from us though, just search this classic World War II recipe up and you will find many references dating back to this era about the recipe. This would later go on to inspire dishes like sour cream potato rolls in more stable times, and folks still kept the recipe in rotation. If life hands you corn cobs, make jelly. This creation of the Dust Bowl is the best example of use it or else it will be used on you. Indeed, in the old days when food was hard to come by, one could not even discard corn cobs. Yes, the very same cobs that you discarded in the bin today were used to make a sweet golden jelly that was related to honey in taste. The process was simple. Take the cobs, boil them to get the corn starchy goodness, add sugar and pectin, and you have corn cob jelly. It was inexpensive, convenient, and could be slathered on the constant companion of the Depression: bread. The taste? Light and sweet with a very subtle corn taste. And let's face it, when you are living off of crumbs, any type of jelly is a treat. Corn cob jelly may not sound like a dish that could be eaten today, but during that period, it was the best invention to solve a real issue. Everyone wanted to get as much use out of every kernel of corn as was humanly possible, figuratively and literally. Now it is a recipe that one might find in a rustic fare or a book of curious recipes, but in the past, it was a true example of people's creativity. At the very least, corn cob jelly makes us remember that life is a little sweeter when it's as corny as it is sweet. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Okay, this next one sounds like some kind of alien food, but Milkorno was a Depression-era kitchen miracle. It was a government-invented mixture of cornmeal and dried milk powder, designed to be a cheap and nutritious substitute for more expensive foods. A research team led by Flora Rose developed Milkorno, Milkowato, and Milkweedo cereals in the early 1930s, and they were sold exclusively to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration for distribution to Americans impoverished by the Depression. It was claimed that by substituting Milkorno for flour and cornmeal, a family of 5 could eat for less than $5 a week. The best part about Milkorno was its versatility. You could use it as a base for porridge, bake it into cornbread, or even use it to thicken soups. And while it might not sound super exciting, Milkorno dishes could actually be pretty tasty with the right seasonings and a bit of creativity. With the rise of delicious cereals, there's no room for it in our diets now, but hey, no one's going to judge you if you want to give it a try. A more simple breakfast to get people's day started was creamed peas on toast. Look, lots of homes could only use so much butter and spices like cinnamon or other toppings very popular with toast nowadays were definitely out of the question. People still need a good kick to get their Monday in motion, and these peas were not only a wonderful source of protein, but the cream on the toast made for a filling breakfast too. There was a massive emphasis in World War II on dishes that prioritized nutrition while keeping you full or as full as you could get. In America, every household was more than willing to compromise a bit on flavor, elegance, or presentation in exchange for more practical food that still tasted all right. Creamed peas on toast understood the assignment perfectly and fit the bill. If you believe that using every part of the animal is a modern concept, you are mistaken. Dust Bowl families were not sparing any part of the pig, including the snout. Pig snouts breaded might sound like something you dare a friend to eat, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicacy. When meat was a rare commodity, the snout was a cheap source of something meaty, chewy, and quite palatable. The snouts were washed, cooked until soft, and then breaded before being deep-fried to golden brown. The result? A crispy outside and a very tasty meat on the inside. Well, yes, the texture may have been somewhat unusual, but when you are hungry, you don't mind. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. To Dust Bowl families, pig snouts breaded were not just edibles, but a way to pay tribute to every pound of what little they had. No part was wasted, while such meals ensured that scarcity became resourcefulness. Nowadays, breaded pig snouts can be found only in some culinary forums, but they are a vivid example of how people tried to feed themselves when there were no chips, but snouts. Would I try it? To put it in perspective, if my grandma was to prepare it with a wink and a smile, I'd be willing to take a bite. Indeed, when you survive, you become brave and perhaps a little curious. But would you try it? Leave us the answer in the comments below. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy-at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Here's a sandwich combo that might make you do a double take. Peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Yes, you heard that right. Before PB&J sandwiches became a thing, peanut butter and mayo sandwiches was all the rage. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this one tastes far better than it sounds. In the 1930s, peanut butter and mayonnaise were both affordable and readily available, making them a popular pairing. The creamy, salty peanut butter mixed with the tangy mayo created a unique flavor combination that some people swear by to this day. It might sound strange, but remember, during the Great Depression, you ate what you could afford, and this sandwich was cheap and filling. So, if you're feeling brave and want to try something new, make yourself a peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Who knows, you might discover a new guilty pleasure. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well. When life hands you a cow but almost nothing else, you cook the cow's brains. Fried cow brains, or calf's brains, if you want to sound a bit more gourmet, was a Dust Bowl specialty not because people wanted to eat it, but because they had to. They were not fastidious in the past. When you had to fight for your life, you ate everything that was on the animal. Now, I know that fried cow brains may sound like something that shouldn't even be considered food, let alone something that might be considered delicious. For this dish, brains were washed in water or milk, dredged in flour, and fried until brown and crispy. Consider them as the first-generation chicken nuggets. if chicken nuggets had a soft core and came with a helping of angst. The flavor? It was mild, almost buttery, and that was the reason why nobody fled from the dish when somebody served it. Cow brains fried were dense in nutrients, especially protein, and thus a good meal during famine. While nowadays people might shudder at the thought of consuming brains, in the past, it was simply Tuesday's supper. And hey, if you put some gravy on top, it might just seem like you're eating gourmet food. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like: beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup, but then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. I know this dish might sound plain, but believe me, when your belly is rumbling and your pantry is bare, this stew can be a lifesaver. Think of a crispy and tender potato cake that has the perfect crunch to it too, and you have yourself a potato flotty. Potatoes were an ingredient that the horrendous war had not taken away from people, along with other basic necessities like wheat. So dishes involving potatoes saw a huge increase in popularity, and some rather forgotten ones like potato flotties got a whole new chance at life. Originally, it is popularly believed that canal workers came up with this oldie but goldie dish when they would cook grated potatoes over fires until they were golden brown. Whether they did invent the dish or not, it definitely was a comfort food for masses everywhere, and we can easily see why too. Considered classic 40s junk food, we would love to try a good authentic potato flotty today. With hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Brings our round of 25 forgotten farmhouse recipes to an end. Which recipe was your favorite? Comment down below and don't forget to like and subscribe.